Hi, I'm Mandy Medley, and as one of the co-owners and workers at Pilsen Community Books, and as a huge Pynchon fan, I'm really excited to welcome Gus Stadler and Peter Coviello here tonight to this virtual space to celebrate Pete's new book, Vineland Reread. A couple of notes about this evening. First, I'll introduce Pete and Gus, and then I'll turn it over to them. And then after their discussion, there will be time for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the appropriate time. Also, you can purchase this book, any of Pynchon's other books, and a wide variety of any titles, and support Chicago's only worker-owned and operated bookstore at pilsencommunitybooks.com. So now, without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's guests. Gustavus Stadler is professor of English at Haverford College, where he teaches courses on 19th and 20th century American literature, music, and sound culture. His most recent book is Witty Guthrie in Intimate Light, out last year from Beacon, and we actually did an event surrounding that book, and it was amazing. So I highly recommend you going to our YouTube channel, Pilsen Community Books YouTube channel, and check that one out too. He is also the author of Troubling Minds, The Cultural Politics of Genius in the U.S., from the University of Minnesota, as well as articles for Al Jazeera, Public Books, Avidly.com, Social Text, and other popular and scholarly venues. And Peter Coviello is professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Woo! His most recent books include Long Players, A Love Story in 18 Songs, and Make Yourselves God, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism, and of course, Vineland Reread. And now I'll turn it over to you two.
Hi.
Hey, man.
We're good. Hey, how's it going?
Andy, thanks so much.
Yeah, Mandy, we're really happy to be here and to, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to do this. I think we both, I'm not even in Chicago, but I really admire the work you guys are doing at the store, so.
All blessings upon Pilsen Community Books pictured here in their spectacular merch.
Definitely getting one of those.
Yeah.
So, Pete.
Hey, man.
This is, if I may be allowed to gush just briefly.
Why not?
I want to make it clear to people that this book is such a pleasure to read, and I'm hoping to get you to read, or maybe even I might read some of it tonight, as to give people a sense of it. But there's these amazingly lush sentences, the finely interweaved modes of thought, like literary criticism, history, and personal narrative, and a very poignant, larger form, like a chronological series of encounters at various moments of kind of both your political consciousness and the US's political consciousness, which includes a really moving and ultimately kind of a tragic story of how the book is tied to a group of your friends. And all of this kind of involves using a lot of terms and going to places that I'm not a Pynchon expert at all, but that goes to places and uses terms that I don't really associate with the way people talk about Pynchon. And in fact, you kind of gently but firmly push aside some of those terms that I do associate with that discourse, like, for instance, postmodernism. And at one point, I think early on, you speak of that maybe more familiar brand of Pynchon discourse as a style of, and I quote, "dudeish hyperdelectation," which is a really important phrase that we should all be using widely now. I know I think I've been unfair to him and sort of associated him with a certain kind of heavy-handed theory boy in the past. It's a broad question, but I guess, can you maybe give some kind of introductory account of how you're trying to change the terms around the book, and I guess hence what the book is able to do for readers?
Yeah, totally. And Gus, that's very kind of you saying. Of course, that you can see it. I'm sure Mandy can see too why I wanted to be talking with you about this, because it has a lot to do with sort of what you do with Witty Guthrie, who's familiar to us from these particular kinds of like masculinist heroicizing narratives. And like like I don't think there's any way to approach Pynchon that's not sort of like, that doesn't in any way or in some way or other encounter like the cloud of male adoration around him, you know? And like, I guess the fortunate thing that sometimes happens with something like, that's not how I came to Pynchon. Like, he wasn't taught to me in class. It was just like my friends when we were like very young and kind of in love with books and in love with being drunk together and in love with talking, but also missing each other. This was just a way to be together. And Vineland was just great for that because it's so fucking funny. It's just so charmingly, sweetly, daffily, stoner hilarious. And really, I had nothing worth saying about it for like 15 years that was beyond the horizon of, I'd never read anything so funny. This sentence makes me laugh. This sentence makes me laugh. Remember the part about the fake book of Italian wedding songs by Deleuze and Guattari? Like stuff like that, you know what I mean? And like, then over many years of reading it and, you know, becoming professionalized a little more, just encountering these different ways of describing Pynchon that were just kind of foreign to me and seemed to leave out like not only his tremendous good humor, but something of his sweetness and something of his like grief-strickenness. Like, and the thing I'd say in the book, and I'd say again, is that one of the things I just will love about Vineland always is that it's unbelievably funny, arguably the funniest book of the late 20th century, or one of them. And it's also just heartbroken. It's just like a novel of political grief, and it's working hard to extricate that political grief from the kind of standard issue boomer nostalgia that, as people our age, we were pretty familiar with in the 80s and 90s, you know? Yeah. So that was really the hope, was to be able to say something about that this is the kind of book you might just stupidly fall in love with and find ways to value for its like humane grief-strickenness, and that might lead you to like a richer and more acute understanding of its political stakes, which I think are grave and exacting and smart. So that was the pitch, at least.
Yeah, no, and that resonates, and there seems to be this way that you look at places, you know, in the book and its form that could be called, you know, could be labeled sort of like fragmentation or alienation or, you know, some of those. It's really, I guess, inheritance of modernism more than, you know, even more than postmodernism. But you do this really amazing job of kind of describing those, you know, as reflecting a kind of inexhaustible, like, strangeness in the world and in language that's actually, you know, and it's you know, you sort of replace those metaphors of alienation or lack with ones of abundance, and, you know, especially around relationships, like, you know, and care, you know, caring relationships and that sort of thing. I don't really have a question.
No, I wanted that's like, we were talking about reading something, and I want to read that. And we were saying, like, what can we read? And there's like a part that I was like, okay, we could read this. Like, a lot of, as Gus is probably going to be too kind to say, a lot of the book is really just like, it's like bar talk in the sense of like, remember this scene, it's really funny. It's like quoting a lot of sentences and being like, holy shit, so this is unbelievably funny. So after a passage where I try to stop myself quoting them at length, I try to say a little something about like, you know, what's happening here. And I say, it seems to me that an equally persuasive way to say all this, to say what's at stake in these, like, this intense pileup of comic sentences, might be to suggest that what sounds in the unflagging fabulatory undertakings of Vineland is a performed detuning of realist verisimilitude and of the ordering of the world it ratifies. You could call the effect of this sustained performance by a lot of names: an estrangement, a destabilization, a fracture, a breaking loose, or a cracking open, or a lifting off. All of these designations will serve, inasmuch as the conviction they point to is the same. To put it perhaps a bit too flatly, it is simply that our gridded taxonomies of apprehension formalized in everything from the orders of political economy to the modes of art we cherish, among these the novel, to the governing epistemologies of our quotidian semi-consensual real. These do not come near to exhausting the breadth and reach of the extant world, and leave out, in fact, huge yawning territories of even sublunary experience. These ordering forms may be tenacious, enforced with greater and lesser brutality, and may indeed lend to the world what coherence we believe it to possess, but they are not definitive, and they are not absolute. And this, for Pynchon, is less the occasion for melancholy or expressive austerity or philosophical resignation than it is for that tremendous prankish unloosening we have been enumerating one punch-drunk passage after another. If you wanted to get a sense of what it is that can make stepping into a novel like Vineland feel at times like an excursion into some precinct of life arrayed crosswise to the world, to the knowable, and to the already known, you could probably start here. For me and my friends, this was quite entirely the case, and no matter how often we returned to it in our younger years, there it reliably was. That sentence-born sensation of being carried over into regions considerably weirder and funnier and more unhinged, just a small bit freer, we'd have said, than we were used to inhabiting. This is something of what I mean when I say Vineland gave us new bearings, that it rewired our sensoria, and God bless it for that. That's definitely the part of like love song to the novel.
Yeah.
Book, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean that's such I mean that's just a typical instance. That's like one of many of this. Yeah, I really find that take and the way you're bringing it so effective. I think maybe, I guess, to me, coming out of the work I've been doing for the past few years on Guthrie and the so-called Old Left, and I was really interested in the work you're doing, and a lot of the book is doing this work on sort of the history of the left, and the way that I mean the book actually stretches back to like the IWWs.
Yeah, totally.
And not, it doesn't spend a lot of time there, but it does spend some time with Popular Front era people, and then into obviously the New Left. And so I guess I'd just like to hear you kind of discuss how, like, what you've been talking about in what you're finding in this kind of much more generative or lush, like, opportunity to encourage care, et cetera. Like, how does that fit with what you're trying to sort of tell a new history of the left, or what you're trying to say about the historiography of the left?
I mean, I think the historiography is a sort of a really smart way to put it. I guess I would say, so the book comes out, we should say, in 1990. Like it's just right in 1990, and in certain ways it inaugurates the moment that we were not yet then, but would certainly call like the true heyday of neoliberalism. Like the ultra privatization of everything, the great like when Clinton looks like the victory of the left, when the devastation of, say, welfare as we know it. Like, so it in a way I would have had no purchase on it all is kind of about that. And of course I would have had no purchase on it at all because I was reading it as a tremendous subject of the 90s, as a person who could not have made the connections the book is making. And one of the things it seemed to me that the book was about, would say it's two things. Like, this is the like historical argument that I try to make about Vineland, that it's both about like what we would call neoliberalism as reaching one form of like condensing culmination in the late 60s, when like the carceral Madden state really gets a new sort of energy around 60s protests. So the book is largely about cops, really. It's about the utter naturalization of a state of like insurgent warfare against anything that looks like a left all the time. Like, and like, okay, that's part of what the book is about. And it's about the late 60s as, again, a moment of like, not inauguration, but of like consolidation, when the police state becomes sort of naturalized and feels like freedom. It seemed to me the other thing that the book was about, and this is what made it so sad, was that by a generation later, it would become very difficult to think of the late 60s as like a moment of, and this is to quote from Joshua Clover, who, as you know, is very important to the book, a moment of armed struggle, when like people on the left took up arms against the state. They were like insurgent mobilizations of all kinds, and they were not simply cultural, and they were not like the stuff of PBS fundraisers. They were like true insurgent mobilizations. And the book seems to suggest that across the scope of the 70s and the 80s, those just become harder to see or recognize. Like they vanish as a conception of politics. And that seemed to be like another way of describing neoliberalism, not just like the carceral maddened security state attached to privatization, but also like a disposition political in which the actually mobilized and insurgent past just becomes illegible, just becomes hard to see. And it seemed to me Pynchon wanted to write a novel about like the dense webworks of care and survival that carried on afterwards and that had been rendered just like illegible. And that as you know, I was less stupid, I guess, than I was in 1994 when I first read it. I just found that greatly moving, you know, along with his effort to attest to that care and attest to that insurgency in a way that didn't just sign off on, again, like PBS-ish boomer nostalgia.
Could you say a little bit more about sort of specifically how the novel does that? Like, you know, it's I really, it was funny. At one point I was trying to describe or like summarize the plot to my partner.
How'd that go?
There's this woman, she's kind of the protagonist, but she's not really the protagonist, like, you know, and et cetera. Like all these, it was just like talking in circles. You know, it's, you quote that Michiko Kakutani pan of the book when it came out, where she says, like, you know, the problem, these are not deep characters. They're flat characters or whatever. You know, sort of like how would you describe the way it does use these sort of elements of the classic realist novel in a way?
Yeah.
Like, does it have a kind of hierarchy of characters in the same way, and doesn't advertise like who's generating the most meaning for the
right? I mean, for there's a couple questions. Like one of them is like, how does it produce the sense of like insurgent mobilizations as like vanishing from articulability? And one of them, like a character I'm sort of like stupidly over-identified with, is Prairie, who is the heroine's daughter, who is 14 at the time of the narrative. The book takes place in like the Orwellian summer of 1984. And she's born in the spring of 1970, i.e. like 10 or 11 months before me. And, you know, and she has a boyfriend in a punk band and everything like that. Anyway, as Gus knows, her mother, who has abandoned her, used to be, before she became a sting operative for the feds, a radical filmmaker. And so Prairie watches all these films. And the novel never treats her as like naive, as stupid, as anything like that, but it does ask us to watch her like the inconceivability of what she's seeing. Like she's never seen anything like it. She's never seen anything like it. Comes back again. And that seemed to be one way of Pynchon gesturing like this is a horizon, not just of possibility, but of like conceivability, where people came together in this way. Where there were all these little collectives, like the Death to the Pig Nihilist Film Collective and the 24, all these like little small forms of sociality that Pynchon is super fascinated by, who looked out for one another and cared for one another. And often they're staged for comic purposes, but there's also a lot of tenderness that travels between them. And there's that tenderness, it seems to me, is enhanced by the passage of time between like the peak moment of the 60s and they're coming back together again in the 80s. And so some of it seems like some people read Vineland and think it's part of the sentimental turn in Pynchon because it's about families, it's about lost parenthood, it's about these like Dickensian like lost parent figure things. And there's certainly something fair to that, but it seems to me it's wedded to all these other sort of like forms of outblown plotting, these like historical escapades and stuff like that. And I have absolutely no problem thinking that or suggesting that Pynchon is really in love with the novel as such. He just wants to like unravel it. He also mistrusts the novel, and that mistrust is something that he wants to make some other sort of detuned form out of. Sometimes that means treating characters very conventionally and sentimentally, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they're like people walk into the set of a Godzilla movie and things like that, you know?
I think on the tip of what I guess sometimes, or in some contexts, might get called sentimental, there's a part of the book that I think I might read in which you talk about, you bring this wonderful attention to the attention that the novel pays to this character Zoid, who's the ex-husband of the sort of central woman who can't be really described as the protagonist, but like, he's been abandoned by her, and he's Prairie's father, and he's living this really, really kind of difficult and precarious existence in far northern California, which is where Vineland is. He sort of has this patchwork of jobs, like cleaning gutters and fixing roofs and working at a cranberry farm, or something. There's maybe like a connection to a pot farm too. I can't remember. It's this total kind of like piecework that he's like just patching together to be able to survive with Prairie. And you really bring out powerfully, I think, the way that the novel brings this. Really, I think he used the word attuned. It powerfully tunes in the direction of life worlds that now I'm just going to start read. It invents, and the characters that populate them. That's startling for what I can only think of as its breadth of fond compassion. Zoid's detailed labors and those of his Vineland compatriots exemplify what is at stake here. For Vineland is a work whose antic fabulations manage also never to disrupt its patient and painstakingly humane regard for the ways people struggle, the ways they create zones of refuge, give themselves and others comfort, and instigate their own forms of contact with the fragments of some inspiriting otherwise that infiltrate even a world as broken, as carved up and boxed for sale or rent, as this one. It's as though that scrupulous generosity of comportment toward the ordinariness of struggle were itself another of its acts of fantastic conjuring, attuning toward persons and scenes that, within the grinding political climate the novel imagines itself entering into, requires every bit as much counter-normative invention. I recommend buying the book and going back and reading it again, but you can.
No, that comes from having read stuff about the sentimental turn in the novel, and like I get that, and I don't want to dispute that exactly, but I don't think it treats Zoid and the people in Vineland sentimentally so much as it has like this humane compassion for what it wants to read as like the ordinariness of precarious life and struggle that's sometimes solitary and sometimes struggle that's communal. Like at the beginning of the book, we see Zoid trying to get the fuck out of Vineland because the feds are coming. So he has to borrow something from somebody else who gives something to somebody else. He's got to borrow, and there's some people are drinking the pot. That's just a very like offhandedly very moving bit of the book, it seems to me, which holds space kind of amazingly with its complete like counterfactual daffiness. Like here we are at a scene that it looks like Godzilla has made the hole in the thing, like that. Pynchon's capacity to hold together just like lunatic stoner inventiveness, like total weird, just like densely weird shit with like this humane compassion for the ordinariness of struggle and the ways people fight where they are. Like that makes it sort of to me like a beautiful novel of the left in lots of ways,
Yeah.
Like like exactly that sort of like humane regard for the ordinariness of struggle, and like a generosity around the imperfectness with which people get that done. Like Zoid is bumbling and he's kind of an idiot, and Prairie's dissatisfied with him in a lot of ways, and he surely wouldn't have made a good husband to Frenessy, but like the novel wants to take him up in a sort of caring embrace as well, and I find that moving,
Yeah, and that it really moved me, and your take on it did, and it also, I think, resonated for me in relation to the work that I've been doing with earlier versions of the American left, and like sort of, I mean, just the kinds of work that he's doing, and the kind of contrast between the sort of workers' woes of the Guthrie era having this not always reliable, but in general, like established powerful collective union force. And it seems like, I mean, it's not just grieving the 60s, it's kind of also grieving that world as well. Like,
Gus, that's so smart. Yeah. Gus and I spoke about this a little bit the other day, and when you said that, I was like, oh, holy shit, that's really smart. And that would have made a better book had I thought about that. Like, in other words, like the scene of politicized sociability that Pynchon mourns in the 60s, which he absolutely does. Like, there's that amazing scene where DL calls a political prisoner brother. And like, there's something ironic about it. Like, it means to be an ironic line, but it's not entirely like, it's a little gesture about how they share a world, and that world is one of like political insurgency. And like, that's what I was concentrating on. But then when Gus and I were talking, he was like, yeah, but think about Zoid and his precarious labor. Like, precarious labor in Frenesy's father's era at least had a union that had to be busted. Like, the stuff in Hollywood had to be about like taking down unions. There was a different kind of infrastructure of care that's fully absent, the ghosts of which we see in other characters in the book. Like you pointed out, all these other culture workers, right? The heroine's father works in Hollywood as a lighting producer and a gaffer, and he's annihilated by the blacklists. And her family on the mother's side goes back to the IWW. I think that's just so smart, that like the infrastructure of care that might be not just like insurgent 60s mobilizations and their sociability and film collectives and revolutionary cells could have been unions, or it could have been the Popular Front in some way. That seems to me just like, that's super smart, and that is also entirely Gus's observation. I can take no credit for it.
And I'm wondering if there's a way to also maybe circle back, just thinking about how that was undone. That sort of more powerful world of labor was undone, like pretty much immediately after the war.
Yeah.
As basically radicals were forced out of unions, and I think. One thing I was kind of trying to use Guthrie as exemplary of is this sort of the emergence of this kind of like technocratic expert, like kind of I guess a form of biopower with a smiley face, that like he goes into all these institutions and mental hospitals that all claim that they're like the state of the art, like they're the kindest. They've gotten past all of the horrors.
Instead of bringing safety or security, which is what's going to come later, they're bringing health. And they're bringing
right. Yeah. But in some way, like how is there like a can we connect that up to?
Yeah. Again, Gus, I'm just totally drafting on our conversation from the other day, which was again so smart. Gus was noting that there was this. Like vitalized left, and then after the war was over, it had to be decimated. And one of the stories that the book tells is about there are all these insurgent mobilizations, and what's mobilized around them is just an enormous counterinsurgency that's like primarily hyper racist, that understands itself to be like defending the state of the nation as against racialized others to it. And like that's how the 60s gets metabolized like into the security state itself, that freedom can only exist at the far end of something like security, which will of course go completely fucking haywire after 2001. But that racialized counterinsurgent mobilization in the 60s seems to be another moment of consolidation, much like the post-war decimation of the laboring left too, though following out different stresses and following out like a different political economy and everything like that. And that seemed to me like super, super smart, like the decimation that Guthrie witnesses in one set of orders is repeated in a different set of orders decade and a half later, and what it issues it is like related, but of course different. Like Pynchon's writing in 1990 about 1984 and like the smiling Reaganism of 1984, like it's a book that's set in the year of the Reagan landslide, So that's another way to think of like it's accordion like historicism, you know what I mean? Mm. Like, and it wants to think of like what we would later take up as neoliberalism as like the absolutizing of the privatization, but also like the manic securitization of the nation, the commitment to counterinsurgency as way of life. That's, I think, what the book sort of like makes incredibly vivid. California is a good place to do it too, Northern California, with the attacks on the pot growing populations there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I think this is also a place where the question of race emerges, and blackness maybe specifically, because, it could well be the case that the militancy, the militancy with which the left is confronted in the 60s, has to do specifically, I imagine, specifically with the civil rights movement, with Black radicalism, Black nationalism. Yeah. It doesn't only affect them; it affects white radicals as well. But it seems. I'm sure historians have written about this, but it just seems inevitable. That's at least partly behind this more intense response. So, the novel doesn't go there. Like, it doesn't go into, you make some interesting arguments around like the history of the novel as a kind of, force of an enlightenment that involves things like
slavery. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're just looking at the novel itself, I think there's like one little paragraph where there's like a Black radical group that shows up, and it's not a gross caricature, but it's not it's just kind of like there's something jokey about it almost.
Yeah.
What do you think it is that prevents Pynchon or the novel from investigating those questions?
Yeah, there's lots of ways to take it up. Like, one of them seems to me like in the book I write about it using, again, terms borrowed from Clover, about like the incapacity of the left to achieve a hegemony, in part because of its fractured groups. One of them like student radicals, others like racialized surplus populations. And the book is really interested in like student rebellions. So unsurprisingly, its demi-monde kicks tremendously white and, if not bougie proximate, and the characters tend not to be bougie, and there's like multiracial collectives in it, but it just like does not have its eye on the like strident militancies that are inspiriting the left that he's interested in, and that are also, like, more particularly, really solidifying the counterinsurgent reaction to them. Like, it seems to me in the book, the clearest vision you get of like Black radicalism is in the forms of like state response that its villains produce, like the Brock Vons and stuff like that. That the attack on racialized surplus populations is going to enable the villains of the book to erect an entire security apparatus. and its model is going to be like imperial warfare taken home to the inner city. So like it seems to me what forestalls it. Like I wouldn't want to say like Pynchon can or cannot do it. I think, for instance, Mason and Dixon is a book that's much more fascinated by like slavery, but this book, like, he's fascinated by college demi-mondes, and that gives him a very skewed, what I end up describing in the book as like a fundamentally skewed historiography. And it just skews white and somewhat more bougie than like a full historiography of armed struggle might look like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I was thinking today about this and about sort of like the end of the novel, or where it leaves you, and whether, I mean, in some way, it feels like I feel like the sort of ineluctable whiteness of the book is it almost precludes hope in a way. I don't know if you would agree with that. I mean, I don't end the novel with like a sense of a political horizon, or like something, like a kind of something to look outside of the book toward. And I was trying to think about whether, that had to do with, just kind of being sealed in whiteness.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would not think of it as a book of hope, though. I would think of it as a book of non-defeat. Like, it wants to end you at a scene of like beaten up radicals who have not abandoned their radicalism.
Yeah.
Like, and it's still fucking 1984, and Brock Bond is still coming down on his helicopter sponsored by Ed Meese. But like that's I think the strongest version of it. Whether it's because it's sealed in that demi-monde's whiteness is harder for me to say, though. Of course, like the things that I attach it to later, like the Vineland County drug triangle stuff, gets like hyper racist in the years that will follow the horizon of the novel.
Yeah.
And that also is not like a hope engendering scene. Though, I mean, I guess I would say like undefeated is the way I would describe the demi-monde of the book.
Yeah.
And that's as much as Pynchon will give, though he has eyes on other things too, right? Because there's the Thanatoids, the population of people, most of whom have been, not most of whom, but many of whom were killed in Vietnam. Like they're the Vietnam dead who are stunned by the injustices that have been done to them. They can't progress into death. And the end of the novel has them waking up with the digital watches chirping spirits awake. And it's Pynchon at his most like Benjaminian, right? Like if he doesn't have a lot of hope for the political future and doesn't have a lot of interest in like redeeming America as some of his characters might, he does have interest in like what happens to the dead. How, in other words, political futures are modes of care for the dead and for the unjustly murdered,
Yeah.
And that may be a different inflection on something like optimism,
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And that took me a lot. Like, I don't know about you, man. When I first read that, I was like, what the fuck? Like Thanatoids? Like I knew nothing about the Bardo. Like I was like,
Yeah. I'm still not sure. So, I don't know. Is there anything else? Do we want to move to questions, or?
I mean, maybe I'll say the other passage I was going to read is the one at the end where it's like, the thing that I'm going to keep liking about Pynchon is his like refusal to accede either to like the like austerity of postmodernism in certain idioms, or to just like a cheap humanism that's celebratory. You know what I mean? And that seemed to me something worth noting. So I guess I would read. This is my like sales pitch for the book. The book ends, Gus, it ends in reading it this like a summer and a half ago. And it just ends like, It ends here. Nothing about the current conjuncture, as the critical quarterlies say, seems liable to come into especially educative clarity in terms of any single analytic idiom we might find lying near to hand. The rising tides of non-imaginary fascisms I mentioned earlier, the carceral nightmare, the planetary despoilment, the remaking of global polity on the model of liberal enfranchisement for oligarchs, police state for all else, and so on and so on and so on, appears to me to mark out at the very least a moment of spectacularly heterodox need. We might well disincline inside such a moment to relinquish any of our most vibrant and demanding critical traditions, whatever their fractious non-coincidence. Confronted with such fractiousness, the urgent matter, so far as my own battered political bearings can make out, might be to figure out how to make something usable and potent, something somehow nourishing out of their sustained irresolution. And this, I suppose, is a thing I have come to cherish about Pynchon, even here, and even in these dire late days, and even in sight of the many unevennesses of a book like Vineland, which in any case it seems like I will forever just stupidly love anyway. I am thinking of the heartening way the ambitions we might think of as most broadly humanist in Vineland, but not only there, hold space with such measured grace alongside the kinds of political critique in which it is no less forcefully invested, and with the kinds of refusal of humanism in its liberalized forms that follow from them. This is no mean trick, as most everything about our hard to conceptualize and rapidly collapsing present tense is always and everywhere reminding us. If Vineland is ongoingly wonderful to me, it is not only for its hilarity and not only for its ludicrous inventiveness and not only for the acuity of its vision of neoliberalism as the age of total and ceaseless carceral counterinsurgency. I love these things, absolutely, and I've tried to redescribe them in ways that might make them lovable to you too, but I am moved no less by Pynchon's symphonic orchestration of these disharmonious strains, his conjuring of a world where laughter and outrage circulate, each within the orbital pole of the other, to the diminishment of neither. That's my pitch for this messy, uneven book.
Yeah.
Any questions?
I'm sold.
Gus, you're an easy mark.
I am, but
so I think we have half a question in the chat. I don't know if someone got cut off and they didn't finish it, but feel free to drop your questions in the chat. But until then, I have one or two for you, if that's okay. I would love, this is like a dream for me to be able to, if I could write a book of criticism on Pynchon, that would be amazing. I would love to hear a little bit about how this book came about, why you chose Vineland out of all of Pynchon's books. I know we've had talked a little bit about my love for Mason and Dixon, and you also share that love. So why did you choose Vineland?
Mandy, that's a great question, and you helped me say something that I should have said at the beginning, which is thanks tremendously to Columbia University Press and a guy named Nicholas Dames, who, along with a colleague of his named Jenny Davidson, they're editors at a place called Public Books. Anyway, they wanted to start this book series, and the pitch of the book series was like, what about 33 1/3, but for novels?
I was thinking that this book, and because it's a love story to Vineland in a lot of ways, reminded me of a 33 1/3 book. So that totally makes sense.
That was 100% the pitch, like something that would be approachable, that would be shortish, that could be like literary critical, but also would want to tell different stories. And Nick very kindly was like, hey man, we're trying to get this off the ground. Would you be interested in this? And I was like, well, I don't know. I love Vineland, and I've written some stuff with the other hand about Pynchon, and like, as Gus knows, like I've done some writing that's just like in a more like personal mode. You know what I mean? Like I wrote a memoir, which is about like how art or songs connect us to people, but also about heartbreak. And then I write like theory books and criticism, and I was wondering if I could get those two more in the same place. Like, so this is a book that's neither like the Mormon book, nor is it really like the book about my stepdaughters, but it tells some stories. And I just wanted to see like what criticism would be like in that idiom. And so that's how it came about. And Nicholas Dames was incredibly kind about it and really made it better at every pace, and just said like write in the voice that, I guess for me the idea was like, I've loved talking about this book with people I love in places like bars, what would it mean to write an entire book like with as much verve and intelligence as exists in those spaces in a book? So that was what I was trying to do, you know.
Well, in that spirit, in talking the book with people in bars, I wish we had a beer with us, but we don't.
It's terrible.
But yeah. I'm going to turn it back to Mason Dixon, and then I promise I will stop talking about it. But you did talk a little bit towards the end about the similarities between Vineland and Mason and Dixon, and especially like the fact that they were counter narratives to a widely mythologized American history. Do you see any other connections with the book?
Yes,
the two books?
And aside from this temporally, like it's clear that he was writing Mason Dixon and then he wrote this in the middle of it, you know. But I think of Mason and Dixon, like Vineland, as a book that's absolutely besotted with like the novel and the technologies of character it produces and the histories it produces, but who's also intelligently and keenly mistrustful of the novel as one of the Enlightenment's inheritances, along with like enslavement and capitalism and any other territorialization of the world. The novel is for Pynchon not separable cleanly from that project. And that produces in him not like, that doesn't mean he fucking hates the novel. It means he has this like live-minded, wary mistrust of what it gives him that he nonetheless cherishes. And it seems to me Vineland is a book that's very committed to like cherishing and mistrust holding space together. And it's a much smaller scale version, and I think for the reasons Gus has described, like its somewhat insular whiteness, it is like, in any serious estimation, a less successful book than Mason and Dixon, which is also hilariously funny and also humane and sad, but has a much sort of broader and synthesizing historical reach, I would say. But that it seems to me like that like symphonic orchestration of disharmonious strains. The books share those things in ways that I'm very moved by, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
I am also with you in thinking Mason and Dixon is kick-ass.
I'm glad to hear it. I meet so few people who've actually read that book. I think it's just huge and whatever. Everyone reads Gravity's Rainbow and Crying a Lot 49, so just very excited. Speaking of mistrust of the novel, a lot of the younger leftists that I talk with only exclusively read theory. That's what they see as the important, thing to read to inform their work, which it is valuable, but I'm always making the case for the novel. And it seems like Vineland has a lot to offer young leftists, not just in, unpacking some of this history, but in a lot of the spirit, I think, of the humane regard of the ordinariness of struggle that you talked about earlier. What are some of the other lessons that you think young leftists could take from this book?
Mandy, I think so there are the historical ones, like it's a great book about historiography and what becomes hard to see. But I mean, the first half of the book, which takes place, when I am not a particularly politically impressive or thoughtful person, is nevertheless about the ways that things like novels and sharing them and fighting about them with the people you love can anneal you together, can teach you something about making solidarities, can teach you something about like being together. And like that is a basic grammar, as you know, as an organizer, that's just like a basic grammar of political action, is figuring out how to be together and how to grow those solidarities that take place either in love or in disagreement or in disharmony into larger collectivities. And it's not a particularly, it doesn't speak well of me that books and music are the best way I know how to make that happen. Like there are other smarter ways to do it, but books and songs are, among other things, like ways you can learn how to be together and how to make and sustain comradeships. So that's what I would say. And this book is in part, like the first half of the book, as you know, is just a story about that, of how loving this book taught me how to love people that I was separated from and that I didn't want to be separated from, and that I had to figure out how to continue loving and to continue making our lives together. And this book was really important for that,
Yeah, for sure. That is a great case to read this book. Yeah, I love it. Someone in the chat, Benjamin, you keep trying to ask a Coen Brothers question, but it's not quite coming through. So ask it one more time and I will ask it. But I had my own movie question. I know Pynchon is, it's hard to translate to film unless it's Inherent Vice. But who do you think would play Zoid, and who do you think would play Prairie in a movie adaptation?
Gus, help me out, man. Zoid, like we need someone who could really do the like the full Zappa hippie.
I would maybe say, like, for Prairie, Jennifer Lawrence, when she first appeared in that, what's the movie about Appalachia?
Yeah. Or what about one of the girls from Teenage Bounty Hunters?
Yeah,
which
right.
I'm just watching, and which is actually kick-ass. Yeah, that would be a great Prairie. Zoid is harder. You'd have to figure like somebody in their 30s who could do like anticness, but also a kind of hapless sweetness. I don't know, Mandy, who do you think?
I mean, that's a tough one. That's why I threw it to y'all. It's really hard.
I mean, Joaquin Phoenix, I thought, did very, very well as Doc Sportello. I thought Inherent Vice was like super good version, like hard to turn Pynchon into movies. God bless. That was, But I don't know, Gus, you probably know better. I don't know. I want to really go off book casting. Like, what about Channing Tatum? You know what I mean? Like, really sure Zoid all the time.
Yeah, Keanu's not quite right.
And that pains me, as you know. Like, we'd have to have Keanu. Obviously, Keanu would have to be in it. He would just have to play. Oh, you know who Keanu could do? He could play Frenese's dad. Like 100%.
One of the film people.
One of the Hollywood people who gets like fucked up by the blacklist. Yeah. Frenesi would be hard too.
Yeah.
No. Jennifer Lawrence could be Frenesi now,
Yeah.
DL. Yeah. Coen Brothers, I don't know. Yeah.
We have a question from the chat. Is the dude part Oedipus Moss and part Vineland character?
Is the dude in... Whoa. That's just like... That's next level. Is the dude in The Big Lebowski part Oedipus Moss and part Vineland? That's super smart, because I always think of The Big Lebowski in this sort of conventional way as like a Sam Spade, but for the post-60s hippiness. That's great. Like, I just love thinking of, and of course Oedipus Moss is like the detective in that. Like, yeah, that's great. I'm totally happy to think of the dude as like Zoid meets Oedipus Moss crossed with just a sprinkling of Sam Spade. Of course, another great movie that wants to think about like the political history of California as a way to enact the political histories of neoliberal America. That's pretty awesome. That just gave me a love The Big Lebowski. Good Lord.
Yeah, I think the first part of the question just came in, and it says, I have not read Vineland, but I always thought The Big Lebowski was impossible without Pynchon's California novels, which I think makes sense.
That's super smart. That seems super smart. And I will say, like, I do prefer, like, The Crying of Lot 49 is very funny, and he's sort of teaching himself how to do the hyper-paranoid plot. But I don't find in it the same, like, again, tender regard for the ordinariness of struggle that you find in Vineland, and even in Inherent Vice, though it kicks in different ways there, But yeah, that seems to me exactly right.
I want to make the tender regard for the ordinariness of struggle like the new PCB tagline. I love that so much.
T-shirt.
Very good.
T-shirt.
Yeah, T-shirt material.
Yeah,
for
and
sure.
it should be said like the book is filled with failures of like the people who are like Pynchon like suffers the new left version of an incapacity to imagine women. Like, this is the book where he's really trying to get that writer, like Frenesi and DL's friendship is at the center of it. But it's also true that it's unsatisfying in lots of ways, like he has a sort of like he can't quite get out of the like I think of as boomerist sexual prurience and stuff like that. And that's kind of like a failure to produce that quite the same exacting care of regard for people. But nevertheless, there's still a lot of it manages to make its way into the book.
Well, I think we're about out of time, but I wanted to thank you both for joining us tonight. That was a dream come true. Again, I want to plug, if you want to purchase the book, you can on pilsoncommunitybooks.com. It's great. It's the first 33 and a third for books. That's a great pitch.
Yeah, Mandy, again, thank you so much. And everyone, like, look up Pilsen Community Books, get their merch, buy your books from there, especially if you're in Chicago, but not only if you're in Chicago. They're just a great institution that we in the city are very, very fortunate to have.
And you will mail books anywhere?
We mail them anywhere in the U.S., yeah, for sure.
Great.
Well, thanks you both. And
Right,
we'll
Gus,
see you
thank you
soon.
very much, man.
Thanks, Pete.
That
Bye,
was a
everybody.
pleasure.